Right? Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam v'nei Kaplan. L'chaim, my friends. A happy Chamisha Asur B'Shvat, or Rosh Hashanah L'Ilanot, to each and every one of you. So, it's a special day. It's a day that we should observe and commemorate. People who daven on a regular basis find their davening, their prayers, somewhat shortened, because as a number of the Rishonim note, on Rosh Hashanah L'Ilanot, on the New Year for trees, we don't recite Tachnan, we don't recite the penitential prayers. And the reason, ostensibly, is that on days of joy, on days when we're elevated, it's not necessary for us to recite these prayers. Because whatever happens, so to speak, by virtue of these prayers, is automatically, if you will, taken care of on a day that has a unique energy that resonates within it. Now, of course, if we're honest with each other, we don't really know what happens when we recite these prayers either. I very much doubt that the average person feels a difference by virtue of the words that he or she read. And yet, we believe that the recitation of those words are meaningful and makes a difference. And as such, it shouldn't be hard for us to accept this notion that on a day when there's a special energy that's resonating, that in fact, it would be meaningful for us to experience something, for us to be somewhat elevated and somewhat empowered, somewhat poised to do things or to achieve things in a manner that might resonate for days, weeks, months, or even in the entire year that follows, just as a result of the fact that that's the special energy for today. And Rosh Hashanah L'Ilanot comes only once a year. So what does one do on Rosh Hashanah L'Ilanot? The popular notion over the recent decades is that you plant trees, or you make a donation to Keren Kayemet L'Yisrael, the JNF, the Jewish National Fund, and you try to plant trees in the land of Israel. Now, don't get me wrong. Planting trees in Israel is very important. The first Jew, Avraham Avinu, made a point of planting trees in Israel. And the Torah talks about it. Vayita Eisho be'Be'er Sheva. It was Avraham Avinu who began to plant in Be'er Sheva. So there's no question that planting trees in Israel is of great importance. And building the land of Israel is of great importance. There are many halachas that govern the way we treat even the observance of Shabbat, or the observance of other mitzvahs, but certain leniencies if there's a possibility of building the land of Israel. So building the land of Israel, planting in the land of Israel, there are limitations as to what kind of animals we raise or who grazes in the land of Israel, because it might hurt the vegetation of Eretz Yisrael. Very important. But you need, so to speak, the right thing in the right time. And the right thing in the right time means that Rosh Hashanah L'Ilanot is not about planting trees. It's about trees that are already grown. It's about trees whose roots begin to stir and tingle and come back to life. And that will result in new growth or a new season of fruits and development. And as such, there's this idea or ideal that Rosh Hashanah L'Ilanot is celebrated not by going beneath the ground, but by eating fruits and focusing on the contribution that trees make in our life. That means they have a preface. I want to share with you the contents of a letter that the Rebbe penned in the early 1940s. It's a letter that really boils Chamisha Asar B'Shvat, the day celebrated as Rosh Hashanah Ilarot. It boils it down into, I think, its essence. And it emphasizes and explains to us why it is that the custom of observing Chamisha Asar B'Shvat is fruit-oriented, or the consumption of wine. L'chaim. A tree is comprised really of three components. There are the roots beneath the ground. No tree can be alive or succeed if it doesn't have roots. Yet roots alone beneath the ground are not a tree. A tree is the trunk and the branches, perhaps even the foliage, that's seen above the ground. There are tall trees and short trees. There are stout trees and stumpy trees. But the tree is the body of vegetation that is above the ground. And then there are the fruits. The fruits are that which the tree produces. And the emphasis of Chamisha Asar B'Shvat, of Rosh Hashanah Lilanot, is not on the roots per se, although it is when the roots begin to stir. And as the ground thaws, the new season of moisture or hydration becomes available for the tree. So the roots begin to drink or begin to suck that new hydration, but the celebration is not about the roots. The trunk isn't yet freshly hydrated. It will be in the days that come as sap begins to flow into the veins or capillaries of the tree. But the focus is not on the tree. The focus, traditionally, since millennia, has been on the fruits. As the custom of Rosh Hashanah Lilanot is the consumption of fruit, making brachas on fruit, especially the fruits of Eretz Yisrael, and taking the opportunity to drink the wines of Eretz Yisrael, and to say l'chaim, speaking of which, l'chaim. The Rebbe depicts this notion of the tree and its different components within the schematic of each and every human being. On a spiritual sense, that of course that is. We all have roots. What are your roots? Are your roots your family history? Are your roots your cultural background? Perhaps. But for a Torah Jew, for a Jew who values his or her relationship with God above all else, for a Jew, really perhaps for any human being, to whom living a life that is godless and devoid of spirituality isn't called living at all. Our roots are our faith. It is our faith that gives us our perspective on life. It is our faith that enables us to face our challenges. It's our faith that colors everything we see and illuminates all that we interpret. We all know that the eye doesn't really see. It's the brain that sees. It's what we choose to see. It's the way we choose to look at something. The glass is actually half full. It also is actually half empty. So what's the truth? Well, we each have our own truths. We each live by a certain reality or interpret that reality in a particular way. And for a person of faith, the faith is the roots that nourish everything about life. It's instructive in how we interpret things, how we view things, how we experience things. The importance of faith cannot be overemphasized. At the same time, if one views things through the prism of Torah Judaism, faith is not enough. There are religious systems or faith systems that harp on or emphasize primarily faith. As long as you have faith, they will say the rest doesn't matter that much. But in Torah Judaism, the rest is really what matters. It matters. It matters how you behave. It matters how you engage with the world around you. It matters what you do with your time. The fact that you may have faith is not in any way, shape, or form something that supplants or replaces the need to perform mitzvot or the sacred duty that we have to expand our intellectual horizons through the study of Torah. It in no way mitigates the need for us to nurture and develop a meaningful and a satisfying, lasting emotional connection to God, which is achieved primarily through prayer. The Rebbe says that would be the body of the tree. So the faith are the roots, and the day-to-day activities, the way we define our day per se, that's the trunk. And interestingly, Rosh Hashanah Le'ilanot teaches us that it is not the faith that we focus on to size up or to attain the measure of a person. It's not even the daily activities, how one observes mitzvot, how one utilizes their time, the volume of one's study or prayer, but rather we size up a person by how they interact with others, which is the notion of fruit. The fruit are what the tree provides for others. The tree is, whether it gives fruit or not. And there are, of course, non-bearing fruit trees. Non-fruit-bearing trees. We don't focus on them on Rosh Hashanah Le'ilanot. We focus on the fruit tree because it is the fruit tree with its roots and its trunk, with its branches and foliage, that's able to produce fruit for others. And the lesson for us, my dear friends, is that the measure of a person is not to be taken by virtue of their faith or even their daily activities. What are you doing for somebody else? How are you influencing? How are you uplifting? How are you touching another in a positive sense? What contribution are you making towards the life of another? So with that little preface, L'chaim, see we have some participation on Zoom as well today, which is a nice thing. And L'chaim to all of you. I want to focus for a few minutes, if I may, on one of the earliest talks of the Rebbe, an edited talk, mind you, about Chamisha Asar B'Shvat, proverbially referred to as Tu B'Shvat, because Tu stands for Tesvav. Tesvav means the 15th. On the 15th of Shvat, which in the year 1957, late January 57, fell on Shabbat, Parshas B'Shalach, the Rebbe addressed the importance of this day. And he said something which is very fascinating, but I'm not ashamed to tell you that until today, I never really understood it. I've repeated these words many times. I've even thought about them. But perhaps it's because of the whole corona situation we're dealing with that I've come to appreciate a deeper message, and I want to share that with you. And it goes something like this. Chamisha Asar B'Shvat, the 15th day of Shvat, is Rosh Hashanah for trees. This is not something everybody agrees on. I don't mean whether you or I are agreed or think this is a good idea. From a Torah perspective, it's not necessarily a given. There are those, meaning in the school of Torah thought, who subscribe to the notion that today is Rosh Hashanah Le'ilanot, and there was a school of thought that did not. Let's go to the first century before the Common Era. The great Rebbes of the Jewish people are known as Hillel and Shammai. They have very, very different perspectives on just about everything. Of course, Elo ve'elo divrei Elokim chayim. The words of Hillel, the words of Shammai, all of this is the words of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's the words of Hashem's Torah. In fact, as the Megala Amukas points out, the name Moshe stands for Moshe Hillel Shammai. And that's because the Torah necessarily is inclusive of various ideas, various approaches, various perspectives. That's the nature of Torah. That's how Torah works. Torah is, by definition, not homogeneous. And there are many levels of truth, all of which are true, an array of truths. As mentioned, the glass is actually and truly half empty. Well, mine's more than half empty. It really does have some wine. That's true. Now, of course, this is a proverbial euphemism. It's like a game, half full, half empty. But it's meant merely as a metaphor. So there are Torah truisms. And Torah truisms can exist simultaneously because true diversity of ideas can only be found in Torah. Diversity of ideas doesn't mean everybody's ideas are equal. It means that there's a range of approaches, valid approaches, godly approaches, Torah perspectives. Shammai and Hillel came to represent the major diversions in the thoughts or schools of Torah thought. So Shammai advances the opinion that Rosh Hashanah Le'ilanot should be observed on the first day of Shvat, whereas Hillel believed that the New Year for trees was to be observed on the 15th day. That's today. That's why they call it 2. Tes Vav is the shorthand way of writing 15 in Hebrew. Chamisha Asa, we don't write Yud followed by a Hey because that's Hashem's name. That would be the natural way to write 15. Instead we write Tet Vav. Tet has the numeric equivalent of 9. Vav has the numeric equivalent of 6. You don't have to be an accountant to know that 6 and 9 are 15. What a strange argument. What are they actually arguing about? That's the subject of the Rebbe's talk. And today, first of all, this is coffee. It also comes from a tree. A little coffee, a little wine, and we have a little farbrengen together. Nobody really ever explained what Shammai and Hillel were thinking. Why did they have different days, albeit 2 weeks apart? It's not as if Hillel says Rosh Hashanah Le'ilanot, that's in the spring. That's when the trees are verdant and blossoming. That's when fruits are starting to bud and appear. It's a question. This is dead of the winter. It's the dead of the winter on the first day of Shvat. It's the dead of the winter 2 weeks later, or 15 days later, on the 15th day of Shvat. What in heaven are they arguing about? What are the two schools of thought, so to speak, other than a difference in dates? I'm glad you asked. This is actually the subject that I've addressed in that groundbreaking talk so many years ago. And this is something that the Rebbe spoke about multiple times. later on. It's interesting to note as he does point out in the footnotes, that the Gemara in Masechet Brachos on page 36b states, Beishamai b'makom Beit Hillel eno Mishnah. If Beishamai has an opinion, but if it contravenes or contradicts the opinion of Beis Hillel, it doesn't even exist. It doesn't even figure. So what is this school of thought that doesn't even figure? What contribution did Beis Shammai make to us? What lesson did he teach us? What message is conveyed in this dispute, in the frame of this argument, whether or not we look at Beis Shammai or Beis Hillel, seeing Rosh Hashanah le'ilanot on the 15th day or on the first day of Shvat? That's the question. Hi, Ron. It's good to see you. So the Rebbe suggested that the seeming dispute between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, I mean, there's certainly a dispute. They're talking about different days to observe Rosh Hashanah le'ilanot. Beis Shammai says you do it on the first day of Shvat. Beis Hillel says you do it on the 15th. The dispute is not a technical dispute over a date, over what's convenient or what works or which day, because that's not something to argue about. Arguments in the frame of Torah milieu and scholarship have to have some depth. There has to be some rhyme and reason behind it. The Rebbe suggested that the attitude or perspective or approach of Beis Hillel versus Beis Shammai would have to appear in various other disputes as well. It would be the same ideas that would fuel their different perspectives. It would have to be so. I mean, after all, realistically speaking, if Beis Shammai had a certain perspective, and that perspective caused him to view a particular detail in Judaism a certain way, well, if that was his perspective, he would have that perspective all the time. Let me give you a simple example. First of all, L'chaim again. Let's say we use the camp or pedestrian example of optimism versus pessimism, or maybe realism. So if we're talking about the glass, the optimist will say, look at that. You still have some wine in the glass. There's still something to drink. That's a reason to be optimistic. The pessimist will say, the glass is mostly empty. That same attitude would fuel everything from the traffic to the weather to one's economic success or failure to how we view relationships. It would color everything in life. The optimist will necessarily look at everything in an optimistic fashion. The pessimist will necessarily look at everything in a pessimistic fashion. I mean, that's just common sense, because it's not about the details of traffic or the glass. It's not about the weather or about the perspective on the economy. It's going to be the attitude in general that'll flavor or color everything in life. Well, in the same way, you understand that the difference between pessimism and optimism, or maybe we should call it realism. Realism and optimism, the pessimist says, stuff probably won't go right, so let's get down about it. The optimist says, it might just go right. Why do I have to choose to focus on the 60 or 70% of times things went wrong? I can choose to focus on the 30% of times that things went right. And, just between us, neither perspective is actually closer to the truth, because actuarially speaking, you can play with percentages, but practically, when you throw a coin in the air, it has a 50% chance of landing on heads or tails, and it doesn't matter how many times that coin was tossed. So if you toss a coin 10 times and it lands at head 10 times, it doesn't have any greater statistical chance of landing heads on the 11th time. Each time it's actually a 50-50 chance. The fact that 10 times before the coin landed a particular way doesn't influence the 11th time you throw the coin in the air. It can't influence it. Each event is actually looked at individually. So if a person says, well, how many times did the surgery work well? So, well, 70% of patients recover, 30% of patients have complications. That does not actually color your chances of complications or full recovery. Your chances of complications or full recovery will always be 50-50. But actuarially speaking, it does make a difference. And somehow the insurance business is making money. So I suppose it does work, although it has nothing to do with the actual technical reality. In the end, it's a wise way to invest. Of course, the reason I'm sharing all of this Narishkeit with you is simply to make the point that the perspective or way we choose to look at life, the way we choose to respond to realities, whether we choose to look at things optimistically, highlighting the likelihood of things going well, or emphasizing the negativity, is a choice we make that will necessarily color every circumstance, every situation. This is a metaphor. It's a parable. The point is that if Beis Shammai, the school of Shammai, had a certain approach, then the school of Hillel had a different approach, then all their arguments would have to fall along the same fault lines. It would have to be the same thing. Now this is easy to say, but of course difficult to be able to discover, to plumb the depths and discover, because on the surface, here Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai are talking about a date on the calendar in February or January. Here Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai are talking about something totally different. So it takes tremendous profundity to be able to look past the details and to be able to discover what fuels that attitude or approach. You know, think of it as a psychologist who would say, why does this person react a certain way? Well, we have to figure out how that person thinks. The Secret Service does this very well. Detectives do this well. CSIS has files on people, and they figure out what makes a person tick. In no particular relevance, I'll just share with you something interesting that I discovered a few years ago. Menachem Begin was one of the fiercest Jewish patriots of the 20th century. I don't think anybody can argue about that. You can disagree with his attitude or approach, but he loved the land, people, and God and Torah of Israel with all his heart and every fiber of his being. And he was a hero. Even those who don't agree with things he did or approaches he took, the man was a hero. Against impossible odds, he continued to prevail and to soldier on. Now, most of the people I know, and I know there are those who will disagree, but most of the people that I know and converse with on a regular basis do not think that Jimmy Carter was a big tzaddik. I certainly don't think he was a tzaddik. I don't think he loved Jews very much. I think he did much to harm Israel. But Jimmy Carter, during his tenure, during his administration, he brought Menachem Begin to the table, and he made a proverbial peace with Egypt. Now, we can argue about this till the cows come home. I'm not so sure that was a good idea or necessary or actually prevented future wars. And the fact that Israel and Egypt didn't get into a war since is not necessarily because they had a peace treaty, but let's leave that as an aside. It wasn't what anybody expected from Begin. How did it happen? So a couple of years ago, I heard the following. Jimmy Carter, the president at the time, instructed the CIA to find every piece of information on Menachem Begin and to discover what makes the man tick. And for all that Jimmy Carter was looked at as a fool, he's actually a very smart man, very wily, very clever. And he devised this strategy, but if they could find what makes Menachem Begin tick, they could find a way to appeal and to kind of stir him and get him to go a certain direction. And President Carter understood from the reports he received that Menachem Begin was fiercely proud of his Judaism. And With a team of psychologists, the CIA develops a plan to be able to disarm Menachem Begin, one of the most fiercely, militantly, so to speak, forceful Jews of his time. They had a Shabbat dinner in the Waldorf Astoria, and President Carter wore a yarmulke, along with the Secretary of State and senior members of his cabinet. And they asked Menachem Begin to make Kiddush for them, a Friday night, kosher Friday night dinner. And they had him make Kiddush. And they had him explain what Shabbat is and what it means to a Jew who's inspired by Torah values. And Menachem Begin was so taken by this experience. He was so overwhelmed by the opportunity that he had to speak to the most powerful man in the world about Shabbat and to share with him what Shabbat meant to him. He was so moved by the fact that the president put on a yarmulke, a kippah, and participated in a Friday night dinner and asked questions, that he essentially was made into putty in the hands of the American administration. And the rest, as they say, is history. I'm sharing this with you, not because I want to argue with you about peace processes or whether it was good or bad, what Menachem Begin did. I'm sharing this with you to point out that in the end, there is something that motivates every one of us. It motivates not a detail, because the details of life are really conglomerations of something much, much bigger. So if Beit Shammai and Beis Hillel are going to have an argument about a particular detail of Jewish life, it has to stem from a deeper place. And if you can psychoanalyze, if you can use that language, if you can psychoanalyze Beit Shammai and Beis Hillel by looking carefully at the different opinions about even arcane details of Jewish ritual and life, you'll be able to discover what proverbially makes them tick. And when you understand what makes them tick, then you can understand what they're arguing about. So the Rebbe points out two examples. One is very famous. One is, by and large, not known, not well known outside the Torah community. The two examples are such. I'll start with the more arcane example first. The first example is something that is related to the notion of ritual purity and impurity. Now, let's be clear. When we speak about ritual purity and impurity, we don't really know what we're talking about. As a rule, language is created by virtue of our experiences. The word happy was created by people who were or experienced happiness. The word sad is a reflection of a profound feeling that people experienced. We know what happy and sad are. I may not know what your happy is, and you may not know what my happy is, but there is a commonality between us as human beings. We all have, so to speak, a common experience. And therefore, you understand when I tell you, that makes me happy. You know what happiness is. You've been happy. You know what sadness is. We've all been sad at some time. And so it is with all the words in the English language or in any spoken language. They are identification. They are labels, per se, for the experiential existence of the human beings, of human anthropology. How about words for things that we don't understand, see, feel, touch, or experience? Do we have words for those things? So if they're scientific realities, like atoms, we have a word for it. That's a word we made, and we can understand it even if we can't see, feel, or touch it per se. But what if we can't see it under a microscope? And what if it doesn't actually make sense to us? Nuclear physics is very logical. It makes perfect sense. It really does. Ritual purity and impurity doesn't make sense to us because it addresses a condition that is entirely in the realm of the spirit. We don't see a difference in something that's tameh or tahor, something which is pure or impure. We can't see a difference. We're not capable of seeing a difference. We don't know the difference between something that's susceptible to ritual impurity or something that isn't. That's why in the English language there isn't really a word for pure or impure, or tameh and toher. Pure is not something that's used to describe a spiritual condition at all. Pure olive oil has nothing to do with spirituality. Pure music or a pure philosophy has nothing to do with spirituality. It has to do with focusing in a singular way on either a particular substance or particular material or particular milieu. So somebody could say, well, that music isn't pure jazz. It's jazz, but it's got some structure in it. So it's not really pure jazz. Okay, that has nothing to do with spirituality. Whether the substance that you speak of has toxins or foreign agents mixed into it, have nothing to do with spirituality. Pure and impure describe the chemical or physical reality, even the philosophical reality. You know, a purist is a person who looks at something in a specific way or follows a particular attitude or approach. It has nothing to do with the spirit. It has nothing to do with the soul. Of course it doesn't. We don't have a word in the English language for tahor, and certainly not for tameh, which is even a more difficult term to describe. We only have words like this in Hebrew because Hebrew, as Nachmanides explains in great detail in his commentary on the Ten Commandments, is not a language made by people. It's a legislated language. We believe it's a language that comes from a higher place. It's God's language. And because it's God's language, some of the verbs or nouns or adjectives will describe things that are or can be experienced only in the spiritual realm. So we have those words. They may be practically instructive to us, but we don't really understand them or haven't experienced them. The laws of purity and impurity are certainly within the milieu of that which we don't experience and can't understand. Which brings me to the Mishnah I'm about to share with you. There's a Masechet called Uktzin. Now, an uketz literally means a stem. It means the stem of a fruit or vegetable. Fruits or vegetables can't become ritually defiled when they're attached to the tree, vine, or plant, because then they're essentially part of the earth. They aren't seen as food stuff per se. They're seen as that which can become food. Any more than an animal isn't looked at as lunch. You can't look at the cow and say, that looks so I don't have the options that the... And the point then is this. The point is that food stuff, edibles, can become tameh, can become ritually impure. Non-food stuff cannot become ritually impure. It's only when it becomes an edible for human beings that it then is deemed as susceptible to ritual impurity. This is not necessarily in the realm of our logic or rhyme or reason. That's what our Torah tradition tells us. Now, one of the things that can become pure, that's considered a foodstuff, is honey. I'm not talking about the honey that the land of Israel is praised with. That is that which comes from the notion of the nectar of dates or figs, specifically of dates. This is bees' honey that I just speak of. Now, bees' honey is an edible. People eat bees' honey. You know, the apple and honey on Rosh Hashanah, but in general, people eat honey. It's considered to be a far superior source of sweetness, much better than sugar cane or the white sugar we use today. So when or at what point does the honey become a foodstuff or an edible? Meaning, when is it susceptible to receive ritual impurity? So you all know that honey comes from honeycombs. And honeycombs are where the bees store the honey. They take the nectar out of the flowers, they process it in their innards, and then it comes out the other side as honey, which is put away for the queen bee. And when human beings raid the honeycomb, or when they raid what you would call the beehive, they can remove the honey from the combs, and as such, human beings can have jars of honey. So the question in the Mishnah is, at what point does the honey in the honeycomb, at what point does it become susceptible to ritual impurity? Beis Shammai says, the moment the beehive keeper has decided to approach the beehive and to begin to remove the honey, from that point onward, it's already considered an edible, fit for consumption, and as such, is susceptible to ritual impurity. Beis Hillel says, no. As long as the honey is within the compartments of the honeycomb, it cannot be considered an edible. Now it's part of the bee's life. It can only be considered an edible, and I quote, Misheyerasik, from when the beehive itself is actually crushed. And only after the beehive itself is actually crushed, meaning that little wax compartments, only then, when the honey begins to, so to speak, ooze out of the beehives, only then is it susceptible to ritual impurity. So the Rebbe looks at this dispute. He says, what are they arguing about? And the words the Rebbe uses is that Beis Shammai looks at things in their potential state. Once the beehive keeper has already set out to do what he plans to do, so essentially, it's honey already. According to Beit Hillel, until you actually begin to break the beehive down, you don't have honey. Another example, and this is more famous. On the first night of Hanukkah, we kindle one flame, corresponding to the first night. On the second night of Hanukkah, we kindle two flames, corresponding to the notion that now we're 2 days into Hanukkah. And we continue to wax and to grow until on the 8th day of Hanukkah, the menorah is aglow and all flames are lit. Beis Shammai has a very different approach. He said, on the first day of Hanukkah, you fire up your menorah. We begin the celebration of Hanukkah with a full menorah, and then we diminish. Now the Gemara says that this is connected to the notion of Ma'alim Bakodesh. When it comes to matters of holiness, we always try to wax and grow. However, Beit Hillel responds, Beis Shammai says, this is connected to the offerings of the festival of Sukkot, which is also an externally focused holiday. It's a holiday in which we pray for or bring offerings for nations of the world, just like Hanukkah is a time when we kindle the light of our mitzvahs and Yiddishkeit at the window or door for the great outside. And Parei HaChag, the offerings brought in the Beit HaMikdash, corresponding to the nations, were on a diminishing scale. But what's behind that? Why does Beis Shammai choose to look at the paradigm of Parei HaChag, of the offerings in the Beit HaMikdash during the festival of Sukkot, and why does Beis Hillel choose to look at the notion of we wax when it comes to matters of holiness? The Rebbe says, once again, it's clear, it's obvious. The psychology, the Torah attitude or perspective of Beit Shammai is we should always look at the potential of something. On the first day of Hanukkah, we have a whole holiday before us. Fire up the menorah. On the last day, we have just 1 day left. Beis Hillel says, on the first day of Hanukkah, you've got 1 day of Hanukkah. We'll kindle one flame, one lamp. On the second day, we now have 2 days under our belt. And so on the 8th day, the menorah is full. In other words, Beis Shammai celebrates or views things in their potential state. Beis Hillel views things in their actual state, a different perspective. The Rebbe says the same thing applies to the notion of Rosh Hashanah Le'ilanot. Beis Shammai says, by the time we get to Rosh Chodesh Shvat, the ground is preparing to thaw. Shvat in Israel is the month in which the thaw begins. Now, the fact that it doesn't actually thaw, or the fact that there isn't hydration that begins to be absorbed by the roots of the tree until the 15th day, doesn't change the fact that the ground is fertile. The stage is being set. The atmosphere, if you will, the environment is prepared. Theoretically, we're prepared now. We're ready for a new season. Beis Hillel says we can't be ready for a new season. The new season has to actually begin. And whilst it won't begin with fruits or even blossoms, whilst it won't begin even with a tree that's come to life, it will begin with the sap that begins to course through the veins or capillaries of the roots deep under the ground. Once again, an argument between the potential and the practical. I've studied this many times and I've thought about it a lot. But somehow today it speaks to me differently. Let me tell you what's always bothered me about this argument, this idea. We're all practical people. Realistically, who would follow the opinion of Beis Shammai? Who looks at things in their potential? We all look at the bottom line. Money in the bank, that's the bottom line. Did you get what you want? That's the bottom line. That's what brings people joy. Who looks at life in a potential manner? But then I thought again, and I realized that actually most of us tend to think like Beis Shammai. Here's an interesting example. Which day of the week do people feel better about? And let's leave Shabbat out of the equation for a minute. When they're at work on Friday, but about to begin the proverbial weekend, or when they're at dinner, having Chinese dinner Sunday night, and thinking that it's almost Monday morning and I have to go back to work. When are people happier? It's statistically proven that people are in a better mood on Friday afternoon than they are on Sunday evening. Why? On Friday afternoon, your vacation or your weekend hasn't begun yet. On Shabbat, on Sunday evening, your vacation, you're in the midst of a rest. You've had 3 days of respite from work, or 2.5 days. You don't have to begin work till the next day. Funny enough, that's not how people function. People tend to always project forward. We very rarely live in the moment. The truth is that Friday evening, when Shabbat begins, is a time in which we still very much feel the work week. We're exhausted from the 6 days that have brought us to the edge of Shabbat. And on Shabbat afternoon, we should have experienced Vayu Nafash, a full sense of spiritual rejuvenation. You had a Friday night, you studied Torah, you prayed, you had a Friday night dinner, you had a restful night, you had a Shabbat morning, along with all of the wonderful spiritual bells and whistles that accompany a Shabbat morning. And you had a beautiful Shabbat afternoon. You should be in a perfect state of equilibrium, and yet people say, oh, Shabbos is almost over. I'm talking about those who actually enjoy Shabbat. They say, oh, Shabbat's almost over. And the point is this. We tend to always project into the future. I hear from people who are optimistic during this COVID reality, and it stinks. Let's not fool ourselves. This isn't enjoyable. It's not what any of us really want. But people who are optimistic are saying, the best days are still ahead. It's going to be good. Life's going to be returning. We're going to get this vaccine. Things are going to get back to normal. Nobody really knows that as a fact, but we want to think that everything will get back to normal really soon. We hope that the different strains, the differing strains of COVID are not necessarily going to continue to plague us in this way, and that we will get past this. And then there's the pessimists who look at everything in a negative way. But how many of us are, instead of looking at tomorrow, focusing on right now? What can and should we do right now to make this particular moment most meaningful? Yes, there's a lockdown. You may be disabled or life may be disrupted. But how about counting your blessings right here and now? The halacha is like Beis Hillel. And I know this. The halacha is generally not the easy path to follow. So I'd like to suggest to you that based on this very profound rumination of the Rebbe, which I don't know if I fully understand, but assuming that I have grasped it to some degree, the message of Rosh Hashanah Le'ilanot for this year rings with a greater sense of importance and urgency perhaps than it has in a very long time. The message: live in the here and now. Make the most of this moment. Every moment of life is a gift. Don't stop living. It actually shocks me, but some people, instead of wishing Fagin and Mazel Tov, said something like, why would you want to make a wedding now? Why wouldn't you delay this? And I think they missed the point. You don't delay life. You don't delay good things. Marriage and families are good things. It's the foundation of the Jewish people. It's not only what our future, but in fact it's what our present is comprised of. The challenge is not simply to be optimistic and think about tomorrow being better, or assuming that it's probably going to work out in a fantastic way. And soon we'll look back at this period of time and we'll say, it's all over, and we can laugh. The real challenge that Hashem puts before us is make the most of now. And if we make the most of now, we do the best we can and find joy in the here and now, Be'ezrat Hashem, we will indeed experience the most wonderful tomorrow. Not a tomorrow in which vaccines will enable us to get back to where we once were, but rather a tomorrow in which the light of Mashiach will eclipse and remove the darkness, the difficulty, and the travail forever. May it be V'mheiro b'yameinu, speedily and in our days. Amen. L'chaim, thanks for joining. And that's my little Tu B'Shvat, Rosh Hashanah Le'ilanot rumination, or thought for this year.